Hello, my name is Sam Miller, and this presentation covers IMAPS and DNS. These are two core protocols that most people rely on every day without realizing it. So IMAP secures how we retrieve and access email messages, while DNS underpins the entire internet by translating human-readable names into IP addresses. So even though these are essential, both of these protocols were designed in an early era of the internet when security wasn't the focus it is today. Attackers exploit their weaknesses constantly. So in this presentation, I'll explain how each of the protocols work, their key risks, and how to harden them on both Linux and Windows platforms. So here's the roadmap. First, I'll walk through IMAPS, what it is, why it is used, and its risks, and then I'll configure and show hardening techniques using Dovecot on Linux, and after that I will move on to DNS and explain how it works, cover its main security risks, and then I will explain Windows DNS setup and hardening, followed by Linux DNS using bind. And then finally I'll wrap up with conclusion and share the references used in the research and preparation of this presentation. So IMAP stands for Internet Message Access Protocol Secure. It is IMAP traffic wrapped in a TLS encryption, and it runs on port 993. Plain IMAP runs on port 143, so that should be considered a legacy and disabled for security purposes. So why IMAPS? So it keeps email on the server instead of downloading it locally, so users can access their message from multiple devices securely. It also integrates with some common platforms like Gmail and Yahoo, and it lets you selectively download content, so you can read headers without pulling down full attachments, which makes it a little more secure. So in short summary, IMAPS is basically an encrypted, flexible option. It's multi-device email access, but only if you configure it properly. So even with encryption, IMAPS has its vulnerabilities. So first is the plaintext authentication. While many servers are aware of IMAPS, some of them might accidentally leave port 143 open. So this means that attackers can downgrade clients to insecure logins. Second is brute force attacks. IMAP servers are common targets for password spraying and credential stuffing. Attackers can take advantage of the weak passwords and do repeated login attempts. Third is weak legacy ciphers. So if older SSL or TLS versions are enabled, connections can be downgraded or intercepted. So these three issues, plaintext fallback, brute force, and weak ciphers, are where hardening steps need to be focused on. So how do we fix this? Well, to secure IMAPs, there are three categories of control: enforce, protect, and remove. These are titles that I made for this presentation. So to enforce encryption, we need to require TLS 1.2 or above and disable plaintext logins on port 143 and force all traffic through port 993. Secondly, we need to protect the accounts. We need to set lockouts for repeated failed login attempts, enforce strong password policies, and use intrusion prevention to detect brute force attempts. And then third, we need to remove any legacy risks. So disable SSL version 3, restrict cipher suites to strong ones, and patch regularly with updates to OpenSSL. Also enable detailed logging and monitoring so administrators can spot attacks easily and early. So these steps transform IMAPS into a more secure service instead of an open target. So let's do a little bit of an overview on DNS. DNS is the domain name system. It translates host names like kennesaw.edu into IP addresses. I put an example there of an IP address as a disclaimer. That is not Kennesaw's IP address. It is just one I typed up as an example. So it primarily runs on port 53 and supports both UDP and TCP. DNS is the backbone of the internet. So without it, users would have to memorize raw IP addresses instead of names, and that's no fun. So it can run as a role in Windows Server or through Bind 9 on Linux. And because it is so essential, DNS is also one of the most targeted protocols by attackers. So we need to make sure that it is secured properly. So here are the top 3 major risks that I have outlined here. So first is cache poisoning, or what is also known as DNS spoofing. So it's where attackers insert fake records so users get redirected to malicious sites instead of real ones. Second is called open resolver abuse. It's misconfigured servers allow recursive queries from anywhere, so which attackers exploit for amplification in DDoS attacks. So it's when a small query creates a huge response and that overwhelms the victims. The third is called zone transfer leakage. So if zone transfers aren't locked down, attackers can impersonate a secondary server and request an entire DNS database and expose its internal structure. So that's very bad. We don't want that to happen. So these are the high impact risks that make DNS a frequent target that I have done and found in my research. So let's figure out how to harden this on Windows. So on Windows, you can configure DNS by adding the DNS server role in Server Manager. And then afterwards, you can verify that it is running on an IMAP Kali scan, and it'll pop up as port 53. So hardening involves 3 steps. So first is restrict recursion to internal clients only, limit zone transfers so that they are allowed only to known secondary servers. And then third is to enable DNSSEC to protect against cache poisoning with cryptographic violation. So these are pretty straightforward settings, but without them, a Windows DNS server can easily become an attacker's tool. So it's mostly just being aware that they exist so you can tackle them now before it becomes an issue later. So let's talk a little bit on the Linux side. So on Linux, DNS is managed through bind 9. The setup begins by installing bind 9 and any related utilities. I have supplied a command line here of how to install it and the utilities. So configuration happens in the named.conf.options file, so where recursion and transfer rules are defined. So after changes, after you put in the command lines here, restart the service and then confirm it with an IMAP scan on your Kali server to make sure that it's running properly. And it'll also be port 53 as well for Linux. That doesn't change. Hardening steps are pretty parallel to Windows, but it's a little more involved because of the command line interface that Linux has. So restrict recursion and queries to subnets only, restrict zone transfers with allow transfers, and enable DNSSEC validation to block any forged records. So compared to the Windows GUI, Linux requires manual editing of the configuration files, which allows you to have a little bit more flexibility, but it requires a little more care. So you have to be a little more careful about what you're writing out. And I find it wise to test to make sure that it's actually running. So to summarize, IMAP security comes from enforcing TLS and eliminating plain text logins and defending against any brute force attempts. DNS security comes from defending against cache poisoning and stopping open resolvers and restricting zone transfers. The same core principles apply to both protocols of Linux and Windows, which is reducing attack surface, enforcing encryption, and restrict access, and always monitor the logs. So you need to be aware of the problems that are going on in your server. So it's always good to stay on top of that. So on Linux, configuration requires direct file editing like dev.conf for IMAPs and name.conf.option for bind, while Windows provides GUI-based tools to tackle that. So Windows is a little more simpler if you're aware, but Linux allows you to have a little more freedom and control over what you're typing out. So finally, security isn't one and done. Patching and monitoring are well and good, but you have to do periodic audits. You have to keep running those logs. They are just important as the initial configuration of hardening your server. So it's always a good idea to go back and make sure everything is updated as it should be, making sure there's no suspicious activity going on. You just have to be aware of the threat actors that are commonly going around and how to protect your server the way that suits you. So to back this presentation, I used a range of sources: Microsoft's documentation, Cloudflare Security Learning Center, info blogs, best practices, OWASP guidances, and security write-ups from Mailtrap, Hacktricks, and Bleeping Computer. So these sources confirm the configuration and hardening steps I presented are industry standard and also widely applied in real-world environments. So that concludes my presentation. Thank you very much for listening.